John McKee, and this is Building with John. In this series, we will be building an acoustic guitar. Hi, welcome back. Last time on our guitar project, we assembled our neck to our body, we created our fingerboard and fretted it, and we shaped our bridge and slotted it. This time, we are going to work on our back. We're going to add bracing, and we're going to assemble our back to our guitar body, and we are going to work on our binding that goes around the outside of the top and bottom of the guitar. Let's get to it. So to begin, we are going to sand the inside of the back to get nice and smooth. So we assemble the braces. We have a nice smooth transition across the joint to make it nice and strong. Okay, now it is nice and smooth. It's a little warped, but that'll all straighten out with gluing the braces on. And now we're going to go on to bracing. So I'm going to make the braces out of this piece of spruce. It's the same type of wood that we used for bracing the top. It's not as critical what you use to brace the bottom as it is for the top, because it doesn't flex as much. But because I have this spruce, that's what we're going to use. So I cut my my 4 braces. They're 1/4 inch thick, and they're 3/4 of an inch deep. And I'm going to finish shaping these. I cut them on the table saw, but I forgot to film that part. So we're going to have, on this guitar, we're going to have 4 braces. And I don't always do 4 braces on the back, but because I have some warp in this that I want to flatten out, I'm going to add an extra brace because I don't want that extra tension. So I'm going to have space them like that. So I'm going to cut them to length, and I'm going to scallop the ends. But other than that, other than some sanding, that's how they're going to be. So we're going to mark them to approximate length. I'll adjust them with a chisel after I glue them on if I have to make some. So I'm going to mark them to length. Now remember, the guitar has more thickness than just the top. It has these kerf strips. So you need to account for that, or else you'll be chiseling, which I always end up chiseling anyway. So I'm going to mark each one. Okay. Now we're just going to cut these down to length on the bandsaw. So I want to scallop the ends of each of these, and I'm just going to use this can as a template. So these are soft wood and they're small, so I'm not going to use any electric means of sanding. I'm just going to sand them up with some sandpaper by hand. Get all the rough spot, round over all the edges. So now we have all our braces cut and sanded and ready to assemble to our guitar. Now I do want to make sure that they all are evenly spaced, so I can so that they're pretty close, evenly spaced. So I'm going to space them 4.5 inches. So that's actually pretty good right there. Okay, so I'm going to just glue each one in place. So initially, there's a lot of warp in this, so I'm just going to set them in place with glue to start, and then I'll add some weight to hold it all down. Now they make specialized tools to clamp your braces into place, but I'm partial to big, heavy toolboxes. So, to get enough weight on here, I had to put 4 heavy toolboxes in place so that I could get that's flattened out across that seam, because I had so much warp in that back. So that'll flatten it out nice. And while that dries, we'll go on to our next piece. So while our back braces dry, we're going to work on our binding. So the binding is important because it seals the edge of your top and back grain, which prevents extra warping. It prevents moisture from getting in there, and it is a nice, beautiful aesthetic look. Now for this binding, on the top we're going to do a 2-piece binding where we have a walnut edge and a honey locust. So it'll be walnut and honey locust edge, and it'll go around the binding. So the walnut will be inside, we'll give a darker line, and then the honey locust portion will contrast nicely with the sides. Now on the back, we're going to do simply a honey locust binding, because the back and sides are both walnut. And that light color wood will give a nice contrast. But on the top, the honey locust and the spruce are similarly colored. So I didn't want to just do honey locust on top. The walnut, extra piece of walnut in there will give a nice detail around the top of the guitar. However, I don't want that to be a very thick piece. So I have this piece of walnut that we bent when we were doing the wood bending video. So it's just 3/8 of an inch deep, and it's an 1/8 inch thick. Now I don't want it to be an 1/8 inch thick when I add it to the guitar, so we need to thin that out, and this is how we'll do it. We're gonna sand down our already bent pieces of binding that were left over from our wood bending video, and I want to thin those down so I have a nice thin accent on the top of the guitar. Now to do that, I have my drill press set up with this jig, with this bull nose block, and a sanding drum. Now, if this were a straight piece, I would use a straight fence and do the same thing. But because I have to go through the contours of this piece, I'll use this bull nose, so that when it comes through, I can swing it through the whole thing without it getting away from me. Then to adjust, I'm just going to give it a little tap to make it a little tighter. And I'll do that until I have the thickness that I'm looking for. So now we have these extra thin pieces of binding. So we have these extra thin pieces of binding, which are going to give a little dark ridge on the inside of our honey locust. It's going to give a dark ridge on the inside of our honey locust. Now I did have, because I was going so thin and this walnut is so brittle, I did have a breakage when I was running through. But the break matches up so perfectly that I'll be able to still use this piece and attach it, because it will be sandwiched between the outer binding and the top. We're going to make the rest of the bindings, all the honey locust parts, out of this rough sawn piece of honey locust. So working with these big rough sawn pieces of wood can be a bit of a challenge because they're very large and they're very heavy. So I'm going to cut this down to a length that I can work with that will give me enough material for cutting the binding. So I need at least 36 inches. So I'm going to cut a little long just because, well, yeah, I'll cut it just a little long. So somewhere in there. I don't care about exact at this point because I'm just trying to cut this down to something I can work with. And I'm just going to draw a straight line across so my circular saw has something to work with. I just drew a straight line across so that my circular saw has a guide. So I'm just going to drop this down as deep as I can, and I don't think I can go all the way through this piece of rough lumber, but we will do the best we can, and we'll flip it over. almost cut through about, I think it's only about an 1/8 inch. I didn't, so it should just break off. Just like that. So, now I have this rough piece to cut my, and as we did with our previous, as the previous time when we cut down rough lumber, we're going to add this temporary straight edge, and then we're going to cut it on the table saw to get a nice smooth edge, and then we will cut the other edge off and we'll clean up this piece of wood. So another piece we have to glue on before we put the back on is our bridge plate. Now our bridge plate goes underneath the bridge and the pegs come through, and what it does is protects the top from tearing out. It's just a nice thin coat. And I'm going to just stick it in place. Then I'm going to use my favorite clamping method for this guitar. I'm going to just put a block in here. It's higher than the braces, and I'm going to use a toolbox. Just make sure it's on there level. Now we have our back assembled with braces, and we have our bridge plate glued in. And now we're going to do, before we glue on the back, we got to do everything that we want the guitar open. We got to do that first. Once you glue the back on, everything inside the guitar is done. So, because it's a lot easier to clamp with it open, I'm going to do some of this next work with before we glue the back on. So the first thing we're going to do is, if you recall, we have this nice stripe pattern with 2 honey locust pieces sandwiching a piece of walnut. And I want to continue that pattern around the guitar. So where the neck attaches, we're going to bring the stripe down. We're going to go down the center of the back, and then we're going to come down the front. So we're going to have that same pattern from our, will extend from our neck all the way around the guitar. So the first thing we want to do to be able to do that is we'll need to cut out our slot, and then we will take these pieces of trim. I have 2 honey locust pieces and a piece of walnut that are the same thickness as the stripe on our neck, and we're going to fit that into a groove that goes around the guitar. So I attached the guitar just to a scrap so I could clamp to the table, and I used the holes that I already drilled for the bolts that will hold the neck on. So I just used those and I drilled it down to a piece of scrap. I am going to run my marks. I want to make sure it's squared up with the guitar. So I'm just going to take this little back saw right on my squared line, because for this one, on the line is exact. just going to slather some glue on there. Just use my finger and spread it. What I do need to make sure is that I don't mess up the cavity that the neck goes into. So we just stick it in place like that. And that should hold it all in there pretty tight. So I flipped it over, and I'm going to do the same thing on this side. First thing I need to do is mark my 7/8 of an inch, and I'm going to go use the seam as the center. It's easier if I pull this off. I'm going to go 7/16 either direction from that seam. So after marking the lines, I've attached some spacer blocks, and I'm going to attach this pattern to those spacer blocks. And I'm going to cut this slot with a pattern cutting bit. Okay, so I have my pieces. I'm going to dry fit them one more time before I put any glue in. I'm going to stick the outside ones in first, and then squeeze the center. I'm going to squeeze them all in a nice, snug, tight fit. And then we're going to squeeze our pieces in place. Make sure this center one gets down into the glue too. So the iron is hot enough, and I'm just going to start at my center mark for my bend, and just a gentle rock. You want to force that steam through the wood so it'll bend. And you just have to have patience. You don't want to force it. If you bend it too quick before it's heated all the wood fiber, you're going to snap it. The other bending, so this mark tells me where it starts to curve back the other way. Then I'm going to do a gentle curve around from that point. You just have to keep working at it just gently. It'll bend as the wood fiber. Close to done. And you want to be careful when you do the bigger bout. Remember, it's not as tight. Now that the end detail is dry, we're going to remove the excess. So here's our assembled back. We're almost ready to attach it to the guitar, but I want to do some cleanup first. So I had some glue squeeze out that I want to remove, because once I get the guitar together, I won't be able to do anything to the inside anymore. The brace, where the glue squeeze out was, and just scrape it off there. Okay, we've cleaned up our glue. I'm happier with that. Next thing we want to do is fit it. So some of these braces, like this brace, came a little close to the edge, a couple of these. So we're going to need to trim them off a little bit. So we're going to need to trim them off a little bit. So I'm going to lay this on so the seam lines up with the center, so I can know how much I need to trim. Okay. So now we'll prepare the body for the back. Let's just verify one more time if I line it up that all of the braces fit nicely. Okay. So the back is good. So the first thing we need to do in this preparation is make sure that our edges are level. So in a couple places I feel the kerf strip is slightly above the side. So we want that to all be flush. So it doesn't take a whole lot, so I'm just going to use this sanding block with some sandpaper. I'm going to go around the outside and make sure it's all level. We're ready to glue our back to our body. Now, one thing I did find and I want to be very careful about the amount of glue at this point, because if I get too much squeeze out inside the guitar, it'll be visible and next to impossible to clean up. Let's position our top, and we're going to check our position a couple times. I want to make sure my seam lines up with the center of my detail, as I have. Make sure it is clamped . Our back has been glued on, so we have a full body. The back overhangs the sides a little bit, so we're going to flush trim that. before we move on. Now we're going to add that straight detail that we added on the ends and that's on the back of the neck, all the way down the back. Before we can do that, we need to smooth this and make sure it's smooth and flush. So I want to make sure that my detail on the back lines up perfectly with my detail on the ends. So I'm going to take the square and I'm just going to mark with a sharp pencil up across the back so I have an exact mark to use. So once I have that marked, I'm going to take this straight edge and just mark down the whole back side. So I have it marked out, the channel, where the channel is going to be cut. I'm just going to take some straight edge flat, straight edge pieces. I'm going to line up on that mark. So the router is set up to cut just below the surface, about halfway through the back material. I don't know if you can see with the dark wood that there's a groove cut down the center. And now we will fit these pieces in for real. So now we have the stripe inlaid on the back side of the guitar. We're going to trim it all down and make it flush. Now I'm going to start trimming off the higher center. trim it down close this way with the hand plane. So when we cut our binding channel, we know everything will be So we're back at the router table. We have a rabbiting bit with a bearing, and the cutters overlap the bearing so that we get this shelf cut out. And so I've cut it to the height, and you can change this out with different bearings for different thicknesses of binding. In this case, we're going to do different on the top and the bottom. What you can see is that when we cut that ledge, you can see the kerfing strip inside, and that's why we added it, to give more thickness to that side where we're gluing, so that we didn't cut away. So now on top we're going to have this double binding, so it'll have a dark line of walnut with the honey locust outside binding. Because it's a soft wood, the spruce top got a lot of little fibers when we used the router bit to cut that shelf for the binding. So I'm just running around with sandpaper and a sanding block just to knock those fibers off so we can get a better glue. So I'm just going to add a bead of glue all the way around. But I need to be careful. I'm going to need to get glue on the outside of the walnut piece also. So I'm going to start with just loosely positioning my walnut piece in. It should be, oops, I didn't get enough glue on this edge. You need to make sure that it glues to the top. Loosely fit that in. Now I'm going to add more glue on the outside of the walnut so that I can sandwich it all together with the honey locust. So I've got that coated with glue. Now I'm going to fit the honey locust piece in the same way. And so I'm going to start getting glue all over myself. So I'm going to start. Wasn't prepared. So in the center, between the belts, in the skinny spot, in the waist, for the proper term, I'm just going to take a piece of tape and I just use some painter's tape, and I'm just going to make sure it's stuck to the side well and pull it tight across the top. Painter's tape is nice because it won't take the fibers off of the from the spruce, won't pull fibers up. So I know the waist is in the right spot. Make sure your binding is pressed down into. Nope, I wasn't making sure it was seated. And mark it. You don't have to glue them both at the same time. You could essentially do double binding. So I removed the tape. Our binding is glued in place, both the front and back. And now we need to bring this down to level and sand on both sides, palm plane. So I'm just going to use the edge of the hand plane so that I don't cut into the top at all. I'm going to get it close. Now we're back to the router table. Because the binding is slightly proud of the surface of the side, we're going to use a flush trim bit like we did before and trim it flush. So in order to make a matching filler to the color, I'm going to take walnut sawdust and just add some glue and mix it up into a sawdust glue paste. I'm going to take this little piece of scrap as an applicator, and I'm just going to squeeze it into the cracks. The fill dried, and now it's time to just sand it off. On the peg head we have the hole where we access the truss rod. We need to make a cover for that. So I'm going to use a piece of the same material that I used for the sides. I want to make it a little thinner because I don't want much profile on it to interfere with strings. So to do that, we're going to use a sanding drum on the drill press. So to thin this out, we're back to the drill press with the sanding drum. This time I have it fitted with a straight fence, so I can run this straight through. So with that, we're taking it down to about half the thickness that it was before. I rough cut a shape. Now I'm going to perfect that shape just using a piece of sandpaper. So I think that will be a nice cover.